Okay, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. So it's a poem with a lot of haunting wistfulness about it. A lot of themes. I'm going to go through the themes now. Regret. Okay, so first we have this image of a fork-like shaped road, which I see as an extended metaphor for what might have happened, and there's just sort of decisions that we make. There's sort of a heavy sense of regret through that. So it's like this idea of, for everything we choose to do, we also choose not to do something. So perhaps it's emphasizing the importance of making informed decisions. And you could argue that there is a regret highlighted by this idea of, sorry, I could not travel both. This sort of apologetic sorry, apologizing to himself or maybe to someone else that they've let down by choosing this path in life. So there's sort of a heavy sort of haunting sense about that. And then there's this sort of regret about others, perhaps. He says, I doubted if I should ever come back. Perhaps that's talking about this idea of, regret for leaving people or places in his life and never returning. It sort of links to the point I said before. The next point, we have this informal register. It's very anecdotal. It's like he's talking to someone else or maybe himself in like a sort of stream of consciousness sort of thoughts. So you could argue, in the sense of regret, the regret has led to this sort of loneliness and isolation, which is why he will use such a reflective tone, because he's dwelling on the past. So we have strict rhyming quintanes as a sort of structural point, which you could see as the thoughts plaguing his mind constantly, and sort of his going over in his mind constantly, and he can't let go of them, which is reflected through the strict rhyming quintones. And now we have this idea of, oh, I kept the first for another day, and this sort of oh, and it's sort of exclamation. It's very informal. Perhaps he's mocking himself. He's like, oh, I kept the first for another day. He's sort of highlighting his foolishness, naivety, and yeah. And then, and I took the one less travelled by. It's the sort of informal pause over the line, which is the caesura. It's sort of with the dash. It's a non-fluency feature, and it's very conversational, suggesting that some kind of pause for an overwhelming emotion. And you can interpret that emotion any way. Like, you could see it as some kind of smile of satisfaction, sort of laughter, or this sort of pain and regret of like a voice breaking off in sort of sorrow. The pace could slow down. The pace seems to slow down to the pause, as if he's sort of breaking down in sadness, becoming more unstable perhaps. And it's sort of this sort of shudder maybe. So that's regret. Yeah, next we have the difficulty of making choices. So you could argue that there are these two identical paths that sort of he explores and talks about. And he says they're really about the same, which is very uncertain. And the awkward syntax, the sort of inverted syntax, shows his indecision. They're really about the same. And then there's also equally lay. At the time, the choices do seem indistinguishable. And there's nothing, look down as far as I could. And could really suggests limitations despite the effort. This sort of restriction, of sort of lack of, human potential. We can't see how actions will turn out. It's one of those things that's a higher power above us. It's down to chance and luck, and just sort of, we just have to leave it to that. And then you could argue the sort of theme of pride and happiness, and perhaps in the non-conformity. So it's in first person, and you sort of get this sense of this sort of bravery and this sort of unique dramatic tone. These very sort of dramatic storytelling, especially with things like when he says that, and that has made all the difference. So we get this sort of idea of a self-obsessed narrator, perhaps proud of himself for his uniqueness, individuality. Perhaps he's very happy and in control of his thoughts. You could say that the regular rhyme scheme, the A-B-A-A-B, with 4 stanzas, which is very sort of regular, Could argue that he's in control of himself. He's he's not all over the place. And then he also chooses the grassy option. You could say, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Perhaps it shows he's influenced by appearance. Is he materialistic? Or you could say, are things as they seem? It seems lush and nice, but is it superficial? Is sort of Frost saying something about how we shouldn't choose the one that looks more appealing? In the now, we should think about it more carefully. I don't know. Okay, now we have the theme of comedy. We have these sort of exclamatives, like I said before, with like, oh, I kept the first for another day. And this sort of gives this casual, light-hearted tone, and the informal register, very colloquial. And you can say perhaps he's looking back at all this in amusement, like he's telling a sort of funny story. And there's a sort of comedic literal image, sort of this imagery of this fork-like road. And he says, he apologizes for not being able to travel both roads. And you can say that is impossible. You can't travel both roads. So him saying, "Oh, sorry, I couldn't travel both," it's quite ironic, really. It's quite entertaining. And then you could say that pause I spoke about earlier, is that a pause for some kind of cheeky smile or laughter, satisfaction to himself or to the audience if he was, say, saying it. Okay, rhythm. Now we have the rhythm. This is a structural point. We have a loose iambic meter. And you can argue because it's loose, it could reflect this idea of individuality because he's leading his own path. It's a bit of a deviation from the strict iambic tetrameter. And there's also enjambment, quite a lot, because there's only 4 sentences in the entire poem. It's very, perhaps showing how he's in a rush to tell the story. It's very sort of flowing. And you could say, is that some form of excitement and sort of, fast-paced sort of comedic sort of element, or is it regret because he's saying it in a sort of sad kind of way? He doesn't want to talk about it. I don't know. And then the caesura of in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by. You could say, is that some kind of sigh and pause for reflection? So it's a rhythmic feature, but it can be interpreted in various ways. Okay, now we have the tense. Frost uses all 3 tenses in the poem. You could say that talks about this sort of, this idea of time and how, through his sort of experience, he's experienced all sense of time, future and past and present. He's emphasizing the idea that, all through time, these decisions will have to stay with him. So that comes back to the idea of you should, focus on making important decisions. And then I shall be telling this with a sigh. Is that predicting some kind of doom? It's in the future tense. I shall. We have a modal verb, shall, which seems to show some kind of uncertainty and confusion. So that's an interesting tense sort of feature. And we also have this inverted syntax, very awkward sort of syntax. For example, long I stood. You wouldn't say that in normal sort of English, but in a colloquial sense you would. But could you say that's showing his confusion, or is it showing some kind of regret and maybe his sort of disorientated mindset? I don't know. Okay, now we're going to setting. So it's set in the woods with this sort of undergrowth, and that has sort of connotations of fantasy and fairy tale and dreams. You can argue that dreams quite a nice thing, and you could argue that it's very sort of positive. And then we have like the idea of color. Yellow is used quite a lot, and you threw like the yellow leaves. So sort of on the surface, yellow has connotations of bright, sort of happy, shining sort of future. And it certainly seems so at the time, you could argue. But you could also say that yellow is sort of reminiscent of sort of dry sand and old sort of like decaying leaves and like dying leaves. Is that some kind of bitter memory? Maybe that's what Frost's saying. But yeah, this idea of the yellow leaves, you could argue that, like with the sort of, because it's in an autumnal setting, is Frost talking about how we should decide quickly before the winter comes and the leaves fall and die? Is there some kind of urgency about that? I don't know. So obviously there's also a very pastoral setting, and sort of romantic critics and writers talk about this idea of nature as being sort of very liberating. We have this sort of freedom of choice. But you could also argue it's set in a woods. It was very sort of entrapped space, sort of enclosed. And this sort of sense of entrapment kind of links to an idea of false sense of freedom, sort of a false sense of security. Perhaps people that follow a certain path believe that they're following a certain way that could be secure, but life is very random and anything can happen. So is that what Frost is saying? It's up to you to interpret. And you can also say about the sort of autumnal setting that it could represent the sort of penultimate stage of life, because winter obviously we associate with death. Is the narrator in a state of sort of old age where he's about to die? So maybe that's where there's a link to the theme of death. Okay, so thanks for watching, and I hope that was useful.